Richard Mason sat at his desk in the Millbrook County Sheriff's Office, staring at the plain white envelope that had just arrived. The county's new genetic database initiative required all law enforcement personnel to submit DNA samples, and these were his results. He hadn't given it much thought when he'd swapped his cheat 3 weeks ago. It was just another bureaucratic requirement. The office was quiet this morning. Deputy Linda Clark was out on patrol, and the only sound came from the ancient coffee maker gurgling in the corner. Richard ran his finger under the envelope's seal, wondering why they needed a hard copy when everything was digital these days. He pulled out the papers and began reading. The first few pages were standard stuff: genetic markers, health predispositions, nothing exciting. Then he reached page 4, and his world stopped spinning. The coffee maker beeped in the background, but Richard couldn't move. His eyes were fixed on a single line of text. Genetic compatibility analysis. Subject shows no biological relation to registered dependents Kevin Mason and Lisa Mason. Richard read the line again, and again. The words didn't change. His hands began to shake. Kevin was 15 now, a sophomore in high school with Richard's love for baseball. Lisa had just turned 12, all smiles and freckles, always asking him to help with her science homework. They were his kids. He'd been there for every skinned knee, every nightmare, every triumph. But according to this paper, they weren't his, not biologically. The door creaked open, and Richard quickly stuffed the papers back into the envelope. Deputy Clark walked in, shaking rain from her jacket. "Quiet morning, Sheriff," she asked, hanging up her coat. Richard forced a smile. "Yeah, just paperwork." His voice sounded strange to his own ears. After Linda settled at her desk, Richard pulled up the county's medical database on his computer. As sheriff, he had access to all county records, a privilege he'd never abused until now. He entered Susan's medical ID number first. His wife's genetic data appeared on screen, and he compared it to the kids' profiles from their school physicals last month. Susan's DNA matched both children perfectly. She was definitely their mother. Richard leaned back in his chair, feeling sick. 15 years of marriage, and Susan had lied to him. Both kids, not just one, but both, belonged to another man. He thought about their early years together. Susan had gotten pregnant with Kevin just 2 years after they married. Richard had been working long hours then, establishing himself in the department. Lisa came 3 years later, when he was running for sheriff the first time. His phone buzzed. A text from Susan. "Don't forget, Kevin's baseball game at 4. Love you." Richard stared at the message. How many times had she said those words while keeping this secret? He thought about calling her right now, demanding answers. But no, he needed to be smart about this. He needed proof of who the real father was. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a family photo from last Christmas. There they were, all 4 of them smiling in matching sweaters. Kevin had Richard's height, or so he'd always thought. Lisa had his eyes, or maybe he just wanted to see himself in them so badly that he'd imagined it. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Richard went through the motions of his job, signing reports, taking calls, nodding at whatever Linda was saying. Inside, his mind was racing. Who could it be? When had it happened? How had he not seen it? At lunch, he drove home, knowing Susan would be at work at the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade. He went straight to their bedroom and began searching. He told himself he was looking for evidence, but really, he was looking for some sign that he was wrong, that the test results were a mistake. In Susan's bedside drawer, he found a stack of old photos. Most were familiar: family vacations, school events, birthdays. But near the bottom was one he'd never seen before. It showed Susan at what looked like a barbecue, laughing at something off camera. Date stamped showed it was from 16 years ago, just before they got married. Richard's brother Peter was in the background of the photo, watching Susan with an expression that made Richard's stomach turn. He'd always known Peter had a thing for Susan back then, but she'd chosen Richard. Or had she? The more he thought about it, the more memories surfaced. Peter visiting when Richard was working late. Peter offering to babysit when the kids were young. Peter teaching Kevin how to throw a baseball while Richard was stuck at the office. Richard's phone buzzed again. Another text from Susan. "Picked up your dry cleaning. See you at the game." He looked at their wedding photo on the wall. They'd been so young, so in love. Had it all been a lie? He pulled out his phone and opened the county database again. Peter's medical records were there. He'd had surgery at the county hospital last year. With trembling fingers, Richard compared Peter's genetic markers to Kevin and Lisa's. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the numbers lined up perfectly. His brother was their father. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, holding his head in his hands. The betrayal was complete. His wife and his brother had not only cheated on him, they created 2 children and let him raise them as his own. He thought about every time Peter had smirked at family gatherings, every time he'd made comments about how the kids didn't look much like Richard. Had everyone known? Had they all been laughing at him behind his back? The sound of a car door slamming outside snapped him back to reality. He quickly replaced everything and left the house, his mind already forming plans. He couldn't confront them yet. He needed more evidence, needed to understand the full scope of their deception. Back at the office, Richard began pulling old security footage from around town. As sheriff, he had access to cameras going back years. He started with the period around when Kevin was conceived. By the time he had to leave for Kevin's baseball game, Richard had found 3 separate videos showing Susan's car parked outside the Pine Grove Motel during times when he'd been working late shifts. In each one, Peter's truck was parked 2 spaces away. Richard sat in his car outside the baseball field, watching families arrive. Susan waved from the bleachers, and he waved back mechanically. Peter was there too, of course. He never missed Kevin's games. Kevin jogged over to the car. "Coming to watch, Dad?" The word Dad hit Richard like a physical blow. He forced a smile. "Wouldn't miss it, buddy. Go warm up." As he watched Kevin run back to his teammates, Richard made a decision. He would find out everything, every detail of their betrayal, and then he would decide what to do about it. The game started, and Richard sat between his wife and his brother, feeling like he was suffocating. Every cheer, every casual touch, every shared smile now seemed sinister. He watched Peter clap and shout encouragement to Kevin, wondering how many other moments like this had been tainted by their secret. "You okay, honey?" Susan touched his arm. "You seem distracted." Richard looked into her concerned eyes, eyes that had lied to him for 15 years. "Just thinking about a case," he said. Peter leaned over. "Anything interesting, little brother?" Richard turned to look at him, seeing the familiar features they shared. How had he never noticed that Kevin had Peter's nose, Lisa his chin? "Oh, Richard said quietly, "just investigating a long-term fraud." Peter raised an eyebrow. "Those are the worst kind. Hope you mail them." "Oh, I will," Richard replied, turning back to watch the game. "I definitely will." The sun was setting behind the baseball field, painting the sky blood red. Richard watched his family cheer and laugh, knowing that everything was about to change. The DNA test results in his desk drawer weren't just papers. They were a lit fuse, and the explosion was coming. He just had to decide who would be caught in the blast. The next morning, Richard arrived at his office before dawn. He needed privacy for what he was about to do. The empty building echoed with his footsteps as he made his way to the records room in the basement. He pulled out boxes of old security footage from local businesses. The Pine Grove Motel had gone digital 5 years ago, but their older tapes were stored here. Richard started with the years when both Kevin and Lisa were conceived. Hour after hour, he watched grainy footage. His coffee went cold beside him as he noted down times and dates. Susan's car appeared regularly at the motel, always during his night shifts. Peter's truck was always there too, parked just far enough away to look unconnected to someone who wasn't looking for it. "Sheriff?" Deputy Clark's voice made him jump. "Didn't expect you down here so early." Richard quickly closed the laptop, just reviewing some cold cases. After she left, Richard rubbed his tired eyes. The evidence was mounting. He found 17 separate meetings at the motel during the time Kevin was conceived, 12 around Lisa's conception. The pattern was clear. They'd planned this. Back in his office, Richard opened his email. Years ago, he'd set up Susan's phone backup to sync with his computer, a security measure he'd never thought he'd need. Now he began searching through old messages. The older texts were gone, but emails went back further. He found them buried in a folder marked Family Photos. The messages between Susan and Peter told the whole story. "Richard's working late again. Meet me at our spot. I hate lying to him, but I can't help how I feel. The baby could be his. We don't know for sure. I saw how you looked at Kevin today. Be careful, Richard might notice." Richard's hands clenched into fists. They discussed him like he was stupid, blind. In one email, Peter had even joked about how Kevin had his eyes. They'd been laughing at him for years. The office door opened, and Richard quickly switched screens. It was Susan, bringing him lunch like she did every Wednesday. "Brought your favorites," she said, setting down a sandwich. "The kids want to know if you'll be home for dinner." Richard looked at her familiar smile, seeing it differently now. How many times had she smiled at him like that right after being with Peter? "I'll try," he said. "Lot of work today." After she left, Richard drove to the bank. As sheriff, he had access to sealed safety deposit boxes. Peter kept one there. Richard had helped him set it up years ago. Inside the box, among various documents, he found a stack of photos. They showed Peter with Susan at various times over the years, some with the kids. In one, Peter was holding baby Kevin in the hospital. Richard remembered being stuck at work that day, feeling guilty about missing time with his newborn son. Now he knew why Peter had been so eager to fill in. Richard's next stop was the pharmacy where Susan got her prescriptions. The pharmacist knew him well. "Sheriff Mason, what can I do for you?" "Need to check some records for a case," Richard said, showing his badge. "Looking for anything unusual in my wife's prescription history." The pharmacist pulled up the records. "Let's see. Regular birth control, but there are gaps. Looks like she stopped taking it for a few months in 2009 and again in 2012. The years Kevin and Lisa were conceived." Back in his car, Richard sat looking at his phone. A new text from Peter. "Hey bro, taking Kevin fishing this weekend. Want to join?" Richard thought about all the times Peter had taken the kids out, all the uncle-nephew bonding time. Had Peter been using those moments to drop hints, to form a connection with his real children while making a fool of his brother? He drove to the hunting cabin Peter owned outside town. He knew Peter wouldn't be there. He was at work at his construction company. Richard picked the lock easily. Being sheriff had taught him useful skills. Inside, he found more photos hidden in a desk drawer. These were worse. Intimate pictures of Susan that made Richard's blood boil. Some were recent, proving the affair hadn't ended when the kids were born. He also found letters Susan had written to Peter over the years. They talked about their love, their guilt, and their children. In one letter, Susan wrote about how hard it was watching Richard teach Kevin to ride a bike, knowing he wasn't the real father. Richard's phone rang. It was Lisa. "Dad, can you help me with my science project tonight? It's about DNA and heredity." The irony made him want to scream. "Sure, sweetheart. I'll try to be home early." After hanging up, Richard sat in Peter's cabin, surrounded by evidence of his brother's betrayal. He thought about all the family dinners, all the holidays, all the times Peter had watched him be a father to Kevin and Lisa while knowing the truth. He found Peter's laptop and turned it on. The password was easy to guess. Kevin's birthday. Inside, he found emails going back years. Peter and Susan had been careful, using separate email accounts, but they hadn't counted on Richard's access to county records. The emails revealed more than just an affair. They showed planning, deliberate deception. They timed their meetings around Richard's work schedule. They discussed how to handle questions about the kids' appearance. They even joked about Richard's trust in them. One email from Peter stood out. "Sometimes I watch you with them and wish I could tell everyone they're mine. Richard doesn't deserve them or you." Richard closed the laptop, feeling cold inside. He thought finding proof would help, would give him closure. Instead, each new piece of evidence twisted the knife deeper. He drove back to the office, his mind racing. The betrayal was worse than he'd imagined. It wasn't just about the affair or even the kids. They turned his whole life into a lie, made him play a role in their twisted drama. At his desk, Richard began organizing the evidence. Photos, emails, security footage, prescription records, it all told the same story. His wife and brother had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and they'd maintained the lie for 15 years. His phone buzzed again. "Susan, kids are asking about dinner. Should we wait for you?" Richard stared at the message. He thought about going home, sitting at the dinner table with his family, pretending everything was normal. But how could anything ever be normal again? Instead, he texted back. "Working late. Don't wait up." He spent the evening making copies of everything he'd found, securing the evidence in multiple locations. If he was going to confront them, he needed to be prepared. They'd been playing him for years. He wouldn't let them talk their way out of this. As night fell, Richard sat in his dark office, looking at a family photo on his desk. In it, they were all smiling at a barbecue last summer. Peter had his arm around Kevin's shoulders, teaching him how to grill. Richard had thought it was a nice uncle-nephew moment. Now he saw it differently. Now he saw everything differently. His phone lit up with one last text from Peter. "Great day with Kevin at baseball. He's got a natural talent. Must run in the family." Richard turned off his phone and pulled out his service weapon, checking it methodically. Tomorrow, he would confront them. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, he needed to plan. Because one thing was clear, he couldn't let them keep laughing at him. He couldn't let them win. The office was silent except for the sound of Richard cleaning his gun, his movements precise and controlled. Outside, the town of Millbrook slept peacefully, unaware that their sheriff was planning something that would shatter more than just his family. Richard chose Sunday morning for the confrontation. The kids were at their friends' houses. Kevin at a study group, Lisa at a birthday party. He sat at the kitchen table, waiting for Susan to return from her morning jog. The front door opened, and Susan walked in, flushed from exercise. Her smile faded when she saw Richard's expression and the stack of papers on the table. "Sit down," Richard said quietly. "We need to talk." Susan's eyes darted to the papers, then back to his face. "What's wrong?" 15 years, Richard said, spreading out the DNA test results. 15 years of lies. The color drained from Susan's face as she looked at the papers. Her hands trembled as she picked up the test results. "I can explain," she whispered. "Explain what?" "How you and Peter fooled me. How do you let me raise his children thinking they were mine?" Richard's voice remained eerily calm. Susan sank into a chair. "Richard, please." "I have everything," he continued, laying out the evidence one piece at a time. The motel footage, the emails, the photos from Peter's cabin. How long did you think you could keep this secret? Tears began rolling down Susan's cheeks. "It wasn't supposed to happen. Peter and I. It started before our wedding." "Before our wedding?" Richard's calm cracked slightly. "You married me knowing you were in love with my brother." "I loved you both," Susan said. "I chose you because you were stable, responsible. Peter was wild, dangerous, but I couldn't stay away from him." Richard slammed his hand on the table, making Susan jump. "So I was the safe choice, the backup plan." "No, I really loved you. I still love you." Susan reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "When did it end?" Richard asked. Susan looked down. "It didn't. Not completely. We tried to stop after Lisa was born, but..." The door opened again, and Peter walked in. He froze when he saw them at the table, the evidence spread out between them. "Well," Peter said, trying to smile, "looks like little brother finally figured it out." Richard stood slowly. "You son of a..." "Watch it." Peter cut him off. "Those are our mother's boys you're talking about." "Our mother would be ashamed of you," Richard growled. Peter walked further into the room, his confidence growing. "Come on, Richard. You really think you were father material? Always working, always putting the job first. The kids needed a real father." "I was their father," Richard shouted. "I was there for every birthday, every scraped knee, every nightmare." "Where were you?" "I was around," Peter smirked. "More than you know. Who you think taught Kevin to throw a curveball? Who helped Lisa with her science projects when you were too busy?" Susan stood between them. "Please, both of you, stop this. Think about the children." "The children?" Richard laughed bitterly. "You mean his children, the ones you let me believe were mine for 15 years. "They are yours," Susan insisted. "In every way that matters." "Except biology," Peter added. "That's all me, brother." Richard moved faster than either of them expected. His fist connected with Peter's jaw, sending him stumbling backward. Peter touched his split lip, his smirk turning ugly. "There's that temper. No wonder Susan came to me. She needed a real man." Susan grabbed Richard's arm as he moved to strike again. "Stop it. Both of you." "How could you do this to me?" Richard asked her. "I gave you everything." "Not everything," Peter said. "Some things only Big Brother could provide." This time Susan couldn't stop Richard. The brothers crashed into the living room, knocking over furniture as they fought. Years of resentment and betrayal exploded into violence. "I watched you," Richard shouted between punches. "I watched you play with my children, knowing they were yours." Peter fought back, his construction work making him stronger than his brother. "They were never yours. You were just the babysitter." They separated, both breathing hard. Susan stood in the doorway, crying. "The kids can't know about this," she pleaded. "It would destroy them." "They're going to find out," Peter said. "I'm tired of hiding. They deserve to know their real father." Richard went very still. "You're not going to tell them anything." "Try and stop me," Peter taunted. "I'll take them away from you, Susan too. We'll be a real family." "No," Susan said. "Peter, that wasn't the deal." "Deal?" Richard turned to her. "What deal?" "She promised to stay with you," Peter explained, "keep the family image intact. But things change. Time to face reality, little brother." Richard looked between them, seeing 15 years of lies unravel. Every memory was tainted now, every moment suspect. "I'll fight you," he said quietly, "for custody. I'm their legal father." Peter laughed. "With what money? And who do you think the kids will choose when they learn the truth? The busy sheriff who's never around, or the fun uncle who's their real father?" "Get out," Richard told him. "Both of you, get out." "This is my house too," Susan protested. "Not anymore." Richard's voice was ice. "I want you both gone by tonight." Peter stepped closer to him. "Or what, Sheriff? Going to arrest us? For what? Making you raise my kids?" Richard's hand moved toward his gun, but Susan screamed, "No." The brothers stared at each other, decades of rivalry and betrayal hanging between them. "This isn't over," Peter said finally. "I'm telling the kids tomorrow. Better prepare yourself, little brother." He walked out, leaving Richard and Susan alone in the wreckage of their living room. "I never meant to hurt you," Susan whispered. Richard looked at her, this woman he'd loved for 15 years. "Pack your things. I don't care where you go." "The kids will stay with me until we figure this out legally." Susan started to argue, then saw something in his eyes that made her stop. She went upstairs to pack, leaving Richard alone with the scattered evidence of his destroyed life. He picked up a family photo from the floor, the glass cracked from the fight. In it, they all looked so happy, so normal. It had all been a lie. His phone buzzed. A text from Kevin. "Can Uncle Peter take me fishing next weekend?" Richard stared at the message, his hands shaking. He couldn't let Peter tell the kids. Couldn't let him destroy their world like he destroyed Richard's. He had to stop him, whatever it took. Richard deleted the text without responding and began to plan. The week after the confrontation passed in a blur. Susan moved in with her sister, while the kids stayed with Richard, confused by their mother's sudden departure. Peter kept his distance, but his threat hung over Richard like a storm cloud. Richard sat in his patrol car outside Peter's construction site, watching his brother direct workers. Peter looked up, spotted the car, and gave a mocking wave. Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His phone buzzed. A text from Peter. "Taking Kevin fishing tomorrow. Time for a father-son chat." Richard's vision went red. He'd been waiting for this. Peter was planning to tell Kevin everything at the lake. He couldn't let that happen. At home that evening, Kevin was packing his fishing gear. "Mom's not coming back, is she?" he asked suddenly. Richard looked at his son. No, Peter's son, and felt his heart break again. "Things are complicated right now, buddy." "Uncle Peter says he'll explain everything tomorrow," Kevin said. Richard's face hardened. "The fishing trip is cancelled." "But Dad?" "No arguments." Richard's voice was sharper than he intended. Kevin stared at him, hurt and confused, before storming upstairs. Later that night, Richard drove to Peter's hunting cabin. He knew his brother would be there, preparing for tomorrow's fishing trip. The cabin sat deep in the woods, isolated, perfect for a confrontation. Peter's truck was parked outside, light spilled from the windows, and Richard could hear music playing inside. He touched his service weapon, then forced his hand away. He just wanted to talk, he told himself. He knocked on the door. Peter opened it, beer in hand. "Little brother, come to beg me not to tell Kevin the truth?" Richard pushed past him into the cabin. Fishing gear was spread across the floor, ready for tomorrow. You can't tell him, Richard said. It'll destroy him. Peter laughed. Kids are resilient. Besides, he deserves to know his real father. I am his real father. I raised him. You babysat him, Peter corrected. Well, I made him. Both of them. Does it burn, knowing Susan wanted me more? Richard's control slipped. She was my wife. And the best lay I ever had? Peter smirked. We used to laugh about how clueless you were. All those nights you worked late, I was keeping your bed warm. Richard's fist connected with Peter's face. The beer bottle shattered on the floor. Peter wiped blood from his mouth. There's that temper again. No wonder Susan preferred me. They crashed together, years of hatred exploding. Furniture splintered as they fought. Peter was stronger, but Richard had police combat training. I'm telling Kevin everything, Peter gasped between punches. Then Lisa, they'll hate you for lying to them. You're the liar. Richard slammed Peter into the wall. You're their uncle, nothing more. I'm their father. Peter headbutted Richard, breaking his nose. And after tomorrow, they'll know it. Richard stumbled back, blood streaming down his face. His hand found his gun. Peter saw the weapon and laughed. Going to shoot me, Sheriff? Your own brother? You're not my brother, Richard said quietly. Brothers don't do what you did. Put the gun down, Peter said. We both know you won't use it. You're weak. That's why Susan came to me. Richard's finger tightened on the trigger. I won't let you destroy my family. They were never your family. Peter shouted. Those are my kids. My blood. And after tomorrow. The gunshot was deafening in the small cabin. Peter looked down at his chest, surprised. A red stain spread across his shirt. You actually did it, he whispered, and fell. Richard stood over his brother's body, smoke curling from his gun. The music still played softly in the background, an oldie station Peter always liked. His police training took over. He had minutes before someone might investigate the gunshot. He needed to clean up, create a story. Richard worked methodically. He gathered the shell casing, wiped down surfaces, cleaned up the blood. The fishing gear gave him an idea. He made it look like Peter had packed up and left town, loaded the truck with camping gear, drove it to the bus station 2 towns over, planted a false trail leading to Canada. Back at the cabin, he buried Peter's body deep in the woods. The ground was soft from recent rain. By the time he finished, dawn was breaking. Richard drove home, showered, and changed. When Kevin came downstairs, he said, Uncle Peter called, had to cancel the fishing trip. Emergency at work. But all his gear is gone, Kevin said, confused. He took a job up north, Richard lied smoothly. Had to leave right away. Over the next few days, Richard carefully maintained the illusion. He filed a missing persons report when Peter's crew reported him absent. Led searches in the wrong direction. Played the concerned brother. But at night, alone in his study, he stared at the DNA test results and family photos. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him. His phone buzzed. A text from Susan. Have you seen Peter? He's not answering his phone. Richard deleted the message without responding. He pulled out his service weapon, cleaned it again although it was already spotless. The kids were asleep upstairs, ignorant of how their world had changed. They'd never know the truth now. Peter had taken that secret to his grave. Richard looked at his reflection in the window. He killed his own brother. But as he thought about Peter's threat to tell the kids, to destroy their family, he felt no regret. Sometimes protection meant crossing lines. Sometimes love required terrible choices. He burned the DNA test results in his fireplace, watching the papers that had started everything turn to ash. Tomorrow he would go to work, continue the search for his missing brother, and protect his family the only way he knew how. The lies would continue, but they were his lies now, and he would take them to his grave. Outside, crickets chirped in the darkness. Inside, Richard Mason sat alone, a sheriff who had become judge, jury, and executioner to keep his family whole. 6 months after Peter's disappearance, life in Millbrook had settled into a new normal. Richard threw himself into work, leading the increasingly cold investigation into his brother's whereabouts. Susan moved back home, their marriage held together by shared secrets and silent guilt. The search for Peter officially ended after 3 months. The evidence Richard had planted led nowhere, just as he planned. Peter's truck was found at the bus station, Security footage showed someone matching his description boarding a bus to Canada. The case went cold. One morning, Richard sat in his office reviewing old case files when Deputy Clark knocked on his door. "Sheriff, got those soil samples back from the hunting cabin grounds," she said. "Nothing unusual." Richard nodded, keeping his face neutral. He'd been careful to bury Peter far from the cabin. "Add it to the file. Looks like my brother really did just leave town." After she left, Richard opened his desk drawer and touched the hidden compartment he'd built. Inside was a single shell casing, the only piece of evidence he'd kept, a reminder of what he'd done to protect his family. At home that evening, Kevin was doing homework at the kitchen table. "Dad, we're studying genetics and biology," he said. "It's weird how I got Uncle Peter's nose, but Lisa looks more like you." Richard's hand tightened on his coffee cup. "Genetics are funny that way," he managed to say. Lisa came running in. "Dad, I found some old pictures of you and Uncle Peter when you were kids. How come he never says goodbye before leaving town?" "Your uncle always was unpredictable," Richard said, forcing a smile. "Come on, time for dinner." Over the meal, Richard watched his family. Susan avoided his eyes, focusing on her plate. The kids chatted about school, unaware of the tension between their parents. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, Susan confronted him in their bedroom. "I know what you did," she whispered. "I'm not stupid, Richard." He looked at her calmly. "Do you miss him?" "He was going to tell them," she said, not answering his question. "He would have destroyed everything." "Yes," Richard agreed. "He would have." They stared at each other, bound together by knowledge of his crime. Finally, Susan nodded. "I'll keep your secret. For the kids." "Our secret," Richard corrected her. "We both have things to hide." The years passed. Kevin graduated high school, went to college. Lisa became a teenager, her smile so much like Peter's that sometimes Richard had to look away. Richard kept his position as sheriff, respected and trusted by the community. No one ever connected him to Peter's disappearance. The perfect crime, protected by his badge. But the weight never left him. On quiet nights, he'd drive out to the woods where Peter lay buried. The ground had long since settled, wild flowers growing over the spot. One spring morning, 10 years after Peter's death, Richard found Kevin going through old photos. "Dad, look at these pictures of Uncle Peter," Kevin said. "I barely remember him now. Mom says I have his laugh." Richard looked at the photos. Peter holding baby Kevin, teaching him to fish, all those moments that now felt like knives in his heart. "Your uncle loved you," Richard said truthfully, in his own way. "I wish he hadn't left," Kevin sighed. "I miss him sometimes." Richard put his hand on Kevin's shoulder. "We all do, son." That night, Richard sat alone in his study, reading the letter he'd found in Peter's cabin after the murder. A letter he'd never shown anyone, addressed to Kevin and Lisa. "Dear kids," it began, "by the time you read this, you'll know the truth. I'm your real father." Richard struck a match and held it to the corner of the paper. He watched the letter burn, Peter's final confession turning to ash. Outside his window, Lisa was shooting baskets in the driveway. She had Peter's athletic grace, his competitive spirit. Kevin was away at college, studying criminal justice like his father, like the man he thought was his father. Richard's phone buzzed. A text from Susan. Kevin called. "He's bringing his girlfriend home for Thanksgiving." "Your uncle loved you," Richard said truthfully, in his own way. "I wish he hadn't left," Kevin sighed. "I miss him sometimes." Richard put his hand on Kevin's shoulder. "We all do, son." That night, Richard sat alone in his study, reading the letter he'd found in Peter's cabin after the murder. A letter he'd never shown anyone, addressed to Kevin and Lisa. "Dear kids," it began, "by the time you read this, you'll know the truth. I'm your real father." Richard struck a match and held it to the corner of the paper. He watched the letter burn, Peter's final confession turning to ash. Outside his window, Lisa was shooting baskets in the driveway. She had Peter's athletic grace, his competitive spirit. Kevin was away at college, studying criminal justice like his father, like the man he thought was his father. Richard's phone buzzed. A text from Susan. Kevin called. "He's bringing his girlfriend home for Thanksgiving." Life went on. The kids grew up never knowing the truth about their parentage. Richard's crime remained buried in the woods, covered by years of fallen leaves. Sometimes at family gatherings, someone would mention Peter, wondering where he'd gone. Richard would stay quiet, letting others speculate. Susan would squeeze his hand under the table, their shared guilt a bond stronger than love. The DNA test results that started everything were long gone, earned to protect his secret. But the truth lived in Richard's heart, a constant reminder of what he'd done to keep his family whole. Years passed. Richard watched his children grow up, get married, have kids of their own. His grandchildren sometimes had Peter's features, a cruel joke of genetics that only he and Susan recognized. On his deathbed, years later, Kevin held his hand. "You were the best father anyone could ask for," his son said. Richard smiled, taking his secret to the grave. He killed his brother to protect his children from the truth. It was a price he paid willingly, a burden he carried alone. In the end, Richard Mason died knowing he'd succeeded. His children never learned they were born of betrayal. They never knew their uncle was their father or that their dad was a murderer. Some lies, he decided long ago, were worth killing for. Some truths were better left buried in the woods, covered by decades of silence. And in Millbrook, life went on. The sheriff's brother who disappeared remained a mystery, a story people told over beers. Only the woods held the truth, and they kept their secrets well. Richard's gravestone stood next to Susan's, both carrying the weight of their deception to the end. And somewhere in the forest, Peter's unmarked grave continued its endless vigil, guardian of a truth that died with him on that violent night so many years ago. The end.